In this video, I'm going to give you a completely different way of approaching the subjunctive in languages like Spanish and French from what you've been taught. That relies on understanding two key points and three subparts to one of those points. And before you're like, hey, I can do math, that's 5 things. Let me just point out that Spanish learners get taught a useless mnemonic with 6 things, so mine is less stuff and will actually help. The subjunctive mood is a stark dividing line. It's the quitting point for many English speakers studying Romance languages. Nearly every American I know who studied Spanish in school remembers running up against the subjunctive, and usually that's when they throw in the towel. It's portrayed as this complicated, additional, advanced grammatical topic. It's in the back of the textbook, and it's shrouded in mystery and doubt. Not only is it usually taught as being about doubt, whatever that means, but it's also just not explained clearly, as though you need to be in doubt about how to conjugate the verb. I took French in high school, so I wasn't taught this, but a lot of you were evidently taught a W.E.I.R.D.O acronym. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it can also be more confusing than helpful. It doesn't have to be this way. In fact, there's a better way. It's just been a closely guarded secret known only to linguists. Linguists have a pretty clear understanding of the subjunctive, and it's not written on parchment, entombed in a golden chest, and guarded by cursed, otherworldly, ghoulish apparitions. No, worse. It's in a book in a series of monographs that's overpriced and basically only available in university libraries. So basically the same idea, but no golden chest. So today I'm going to explain the subjunctive. Saying it's about doubt is not wrong, but it's not nearly the complete picture, and it's not terribly helpful. Would that it were so simple.
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 My dear boy, why do you say that?
We're going to get a little technical, but in the end it's going to make so much more sense. And it's only a little technical, and there won't be a test later. I promise it won't hurt, and if you stick with me, you'll unlock so much more of the Romance languages. If you're new to the channel, by the way, I'm Dr. Taylor Jones. I have a PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm one of the rare academic linguists who likes learning languages and not just dissecting them. We do exist. That means I also like to share the knowledge that linguists have that your teachers and textbooks might not. And I recognize what's arcane theoretical esoterica and what's actually practical for real people. Today, we're subjugating the subjunctive. This is Language Jones. Today's video is brought to you by Lingoda. Lingoda is a language school that offers classes for 5 languages: Spanish, French, Italian, German, and English. And guess what? 3 of those make extensive use of the subjunctive. German arguably does too, with a slightly modified system. It's one thing to finally understand the underlying system, but it's another to put it into practice and get comfortable actually saying sentences with the appropriate modality. I'll explain modality in the video. I'm currently using Lingoda on my Spanish learning journey, and I cannot recommend them enough.
Sí, sí, pero a mi opinión es muy importante.
They teach with small group classes using a qualified teacher.
They have courses to get you from absolute beginner, which I have used for Spanish, all the way to B2 in the Common European Framework, which I've used in French, or even C1 in some languages. Their course materials are fantastic, but more importantly, you learn to speak from day one with engaging materials across a variety of topics, including, you guessed it, the structure and uses of the subjunctive, in context. They get that language learning is hard, but Lingoda can make it easier. They have different approaches, including an intensive sprint with either 30 or 60 hour-long classes in 2 months, Flex, which has live classes available 24/7 and allows you to fit language learning around whatever your schedule may be, like toddler wrangling and almost 3 straight weeks of religious holidays, and Teams, which lets you complete a course with the same teacher and team of learners. I've tried their classes, I love them, and I wish I could take even more. Lingoda is legitimately a language school, but I can say that they're worth every cent, and you don't have to schlep down to the Alliance Française or Goethe Institute or Cervantes Institute or Istituto Italiano di Cultura, because you can study at any time with real teachers right from home, even in your sweatpants. While I think they're worth every cent, if you click my link in the description or use my code 20jones, you'll get a €20 or equivalent discount on the Flex, Sprint, or Teams course of your choice. So you can buy yourself like 2 fancy coffees. You could even send me super thanks on YouTube and have savings left over for 1 fancy coffee. So click my link in the description or head over to lingoda.com and use my code 20jones if you want to get started with them. Now, back to the video. Let's address the weirdo in the room right away. Spanish students are evidently taught a mnemonic that is something like wish or will, emotion, impersonal expressions, requests, recommend, doubt, denial, ojalá. Ignoring that that's actually W.E.I.R.D.O, and that part of it is literally in Spanish, albeit borrowed from Arabic, this is not that helpful, as I'm sure anyone who's tried to implement this system surely knows. That's a grab bag of items mixing feelings, literally emotion is a whole category, with structural descriptions like impersonal expressions, speech acts like recommending, and mental things like doubt. Ultimately, you're more likely to try to just brute force it all by memorizing all the different sentence frames and triggers for its use. Not only is that a tremendous waste of time, but it's also ineffective. After all, there's plenty of instances where you'd still have to choose between the indicative and the subjunctive, and the choice will change the meaning of the sentence. Leave me a comment if, like me, this is what you suffered through. So let's get into what's really going on. First, some background. Linguists talk about TAM systems, T for tense, A for aspect, and M for mood or modality. Different languages make use of different parts of these systems, so for instance, Mandarin marks aspect, but not tense. What I mean by that is that there's no specific grammatical markers for when something happened in Mandarin. You use the same verb forms for yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and just say something like yesterday to describe it. But Mandarin does have obligatory marking of aspect. English, on the other hand, is both tenses and aspects. So what are tense and aspect? Well, tense is when something happened. We can get into the details, and languages divide things up in different ways. For instance, some only distinguish between past and non-past, others have past, present, future. But the big picture view is that it's just about when something happened. English marks simple past tense with ed and present with nothing or with s, so that's when I said when something happened. That's the verb happen with a past tense marker on it. Happened. Happens. Aspect, on the other hand, is how we think of the event in terms of having internal constituent structure or not. It's the same event, it's just how we choose to describe it for the purposes of what we're trying to say. So starting simple with no structure, I can say, I read the book. You know it happened, but I'm not breaking up the act or spreading it across time. The other side of that is, I was reading the book when you called. There, the calling is a sort of abrupt point in time in the middle of an ongoing process of reading the book. It's like how zoomed in on the details of the action you are. Aspect is a little harder for us to wrap our heads around than tense, but still doable. I have a video about it, so check that out. Both tense and aspect are about the event described by the verb. Mood is different. Modality is defined by Palmer in the classic Mood and Modality as, quote, concerned with the status of the proposition that describes the event, end quote. Glad we got that cleared up, right? Time to end the video. See you all next week. Okay, so seriously, what does this mean? Well, proposition is a term from logic that describes what we might think of as whole sentences, like the sky is blue. And status usually relates to a logical concept of like truth values. The proposition the sky is blue is generally true. And no, proposition is not like a ballot measure or a come on. What modality does primarily is convey speaker judgments about a proposition, sort of like either how true do I think it is or how do I know that it's true. Modality actually comes in two flavors, what are called modal systems and mood. English uses a modal system. Modal systems are an entire interesting world to themselves, but they're the world English is in, so it should all feel comfortable for most of you watching this video. I don't want to go too far into this because it deserves its own video, but just to situate how it's different than mood, it can be where you add a word or a morpheme, a little word piece, to the sentence that indicates something like your confidence in how you know what you're saying, whether you're speculating, assuming, or deducing from evidence. That's the difference between John is in the office, the basic unmarked form, and something like John may be in the office. You're speculating, or John must be in the office because it's 9:30 and he's always there by 9. This is epistemic modality, and no, you don't have to remember that word, and there will not be a quiz on it. We also use some of the exact same words to do a different flavor of modality. So John must be in the office because he's required to be there is deontic modality. Again, no quiz. Took me years to keep them straight. You don't have to remember this stuff. There's a few other flavors that English doesn't really do, but other languages do. Like evidential markers, where you have a word or a morpheme that indicates how you know what you're saying. So it's the difference between it's raining and I know because I saw it, and it's raining and I know because I heard it. Or it's raining, I'm told. Or even I deduced it's raining, for instance, because I smelled the petrichor. In languages that do this, the way they do it would be something like raining saw, raining heard, raining told, raining guess. That is, it's one little piece stuck onto the verb, usually. I don't really want to get too far into this again because it's its own world and deserves its own video, and frankly, it's not why you're here. The key idea is that English has modality, but expresses it with a totally different kind of system than Romance languages, and uses it to do sort of different things. So we can't just shoehorn the subjunctive into our system. And our subjunctive is barely hanging on by a thread, so it's generally of no use to us in figuring out mood. I have a friend who once asked me, I know you're smart and I know you have a PhD and everything, so you're probably not saying things wrong, but sometimes you say were or be when I would say was, and why is that? There's got to be a reason, right?
Yes.
Would that it were so simple.
Would that it were so simple.
So yeah, the subjunctive in English is not going to help us with Spanish. So the other flavor of modality is mood, which is basically a distinction between indicative and subjunctive, or sometimes what's called realis and irrealis. These overlap significantly, and the irrealis concept is going to be really useful later. An important thing to recognize is that there's not exactly a basic form of the verb and then a form of something extra added to it. Instead, indicative and subjunctive are like two sides of the same coin. The subjunctive is not an add-on. So back to irrealis. Back to life, but like the opposite of that. Irrealis is a term linguists coined pretty recently for things that are not in the domain of reality. I'll get to what that means, just hang on. Subjunctive is actually a really old name for the thing that we're talking about, which is itself a Latin translation of hypotaktike, which means subordinate, as in subordinate clause. They, the Greeks, recognize that it's most often used in subordinate clauses. Although the name is misleading, it can actually happen in main clauses too. Palmer gives 6 different examples from Latin following Lakoff, and a handful of examples from Spanish, French, and Italian. While Marie Antoinette probably never said, let them eat cake, the sentence she's accused of having said uses the subjunctive in a main clause. Qu'il mange de la brioche. I'll get back to main clauses in a minute, but first, a key concept. So here's the first key concept. Subjunctive grammatical structures can be either triggered by semantics, that is, meaning, or by purely structural considerations. So it's not always doubt, because sometimes it's just required by how the sentence fits together in the language. You've probably noticed this with words around wants. If the person in the main clause who wants something is the same person in the subordinate clause, the infinitive is used, not any sort of subjunctive. That's literally what English does. I want to go to the store. It means I want to go to the store. Going back to Romance languages, if I want somebody else to go to the store, bam, subjunctive. There's a whole subfield in linguistic study of syntax that looks at how these kinds of sentences work, which is usually discussed in the very intense phrasing of raising and control. It's not really wanting or wishing or willing or whatever here. It's just that the subject of the main clause and subordinate clause don't line up, and that triggers a grammatical thing. If structure without meaning is confusing, let's look at a parallel in English, because we do this too. In standard English, if I want not I to go to the store, I don't use the right case marking on the pronoun for a normal clause. Think about it. We go to the store. He goes to the store. She goes to the store. They go to the store. But I want us to go to the store. I want him or her or them to go to the store. It's weird, right? Other languages, and indeed other varieties of English, use a different structure that starts to look more subjunctive-y. What do I want? I want we should go to the store. See that? The case marking is right, but we now have this extra word. So, in a sense, Romance languages are just doing the same thing. Yes, words like want trigger it, but it's not really about the wanting. It's about whether the subject of the main clause is the same as the subject of the subordinate clause. We often want that somebody does something. So far from doubting anything, the subjunctive can just be structurally required where English would use wonky case shenanigans on the pronouns. The actual technical term is exceptional case marking, which is not that different from what I said, and I like mine better. Also, for those playing the home game, I mentioned pronouns, but it was case marking and not gender, so don't take a shot. Here's the other key concept for the subjunctive. Irrealis. It's not real or realized. This is the glue that ties everything together. Palmer, following Methuen, talks about unasserted propositions. Again, not a milquetoast come on with a wink and a nod. That is, it's stuff you don't want to assert. This does not mean doubt, again. What does it mean? Well, there's 3 flavors of subjunctive: negation, unrealized, and presupposed. This last one is super weird, but it's actually crucial to understanding some of the stranger seeming uses of the subjunctive. So first, an interesting structural pattern is that everything is about the speaker view of the world, but that can also mean a speaker whose thoughts the actual current speaker is now reporting. You don't have to doubt or negate anything. So in the main clause, if I say quizá viene, that's like maybe he's coming, and it uses the subjunctive in the main clause to indicate that I think maybe he's coming. But if I say María duda que sea buena idea, it's Maria who doubts that it's a good idea. So in subordinate clauses, the use of the subjunctive depends on the attitudes, beliefs, etc. of the person represented by the subject of the main clause with those attitudes, beliefs, etc. represented by the main verb. Okay, so negation, unrealized, and presupposed. Those are the three flavors. Negation is not asserted. It's literally asserting not something. It's opposites day, language edition. So if I want to say, I think it's a good idea, in French I'd say, je crois que c'est une bonne idée. The subordinate clause, c'est une bonne idée, uses the indicative, eh. I love French, eh. That's what we foreign learners think is the sort of normal marking of the verb. But if I think it's not a good idea, I have to use the subjunctive. Je ne crois pas que ce soit une bonne idée. That is, ce soit instead of c'est. So where does doubt even come in? Doubt can be thought of as a subset of negation because it can be unpacked in negative terms. I doubt that he's hungry is roughly equivalent to I'm not certain that he is. In Mood and Modality, Palmer explains this in terms of scope of negation. He writes, I don't think that he's stupid can be interpreted as I think he is not stupid. Linguists are mean. What do you want? He goes on saying that this has been treated in some theoretical studies as negative raising or negative transportation because it suggests that the negation originates in the subordinate clause but is raised or transported to the main clause. But an even better analysis is in terms of scope of negation. With the most obvious interpretation, there's what's called narrow scope in I don't think he's stupid, since only the subordinate clause is notionally negated. In contrast, on the less likely interpretation, it's not the case that I think he's stupid. There would be wide scope negating the whole sentence. He then points out that with the negative imperative, the subjunctive isn't used, which supports this analysis. You say, no cree usted que es tonto, where es is not in the subjunctive. Okay, so a little mind-bending, but one key use of the subjunctive is in negation in the subordinate clause, even when the negation is kind of implied by the verb rather than an overt word like not or no. So doubt is a subset of this kind of use of the subjunctive, and it's kind of a special case. It's like categorizing the theorems of rectangles by saying they're about squares. Like, sort of. But negation is more helpful here. You'd use the indicative for something like, I'm convinced that he's an idiot, but the subjunctive for, I'm unconvinced he's an idiot. Okay, so like I said, negative, unrealized, and presupposed. Now we're on unrealized. Unrealized means literally it's not real. It hasn't happened yet. Maybe it will happen, maybe it won't. I first learned about this when I was working on a paper I wrote about negation in African American English or Black English. There's a phenomenon where the word even gets reduced in speech to eem. But it doesn't happen everywhere. You still say even numbers or man. Even Jamal was at the Pajama Jammy Jam, and he don't like to go to those kind of events. I knew it got reduced around negation, so like, you don't even know. But what was twisting me around was that I kept coming across spoken and even written examples in sentences that weren't just talking about negation, like, that happened before I even got there. The subdiscipline of semantics and linguistics does a lot around thinking about how we think about possible worlds. Possible world. Florian Schwartz, who teaches semantics at UPenn, was the one who put me on to the world of non-veridical and irrealis and all the other linguistic semantic discussions of the worlds that aren't. Great name for a sci-fi novel, by the way. In this case, that before is setting up a semantic context where what's discussed is unrealized in the frame of the story that's being told. Unrealized covers your wants, your wills, your recommendations, etc. It's in the future, it's not yet real, or it's kind of hypothetical or counterfactual. As a brief aside, some languages also use the past for modal stuff, and a lot of subjunctives get translated into English using past forms of modal verbs like should, the past tense of shall, and would, the past tense of will. And other Germanic languages do that even more, so Yiddish and Yiddish English have things like, I want that you should be happy. You have your wanting, your willing, your unrealized thing, and then you have an explicit marker of a subordinate clause, that, and then you have a regular old case marking, but the addition of a morphologically past modal verb, should. You should be happy. It's not that deontic modality I said I wasn't going to talk about. It's not a command or a statement about how you ought to be. It's doing subjunctive-y work. Je veux que tu sois heureux in French, where you again use the subjunctive. I want it, but it's unrealized. Not yet necessarily the case. So negated, unrealized, and presupposed. This last one is mind-bending for me, but it unlocks everything. Presupposed is background the speaker isn't asserting, but is trying to keep as background. This is an idea from the subfield of pragmatics, and presupposition could also get its own whole video, but the textbook examples are things like, have you stopped beating your wife? No, really, that's the classic example, and some people are understandably not super happy with that. But think about this. Let's say a lawyer asks you, have you stopped doing drugs? How do you answer that? If you answer yes, you agree to the presupposition that you used to do drugs. So obviously you should answer no. But if you answer no, you're just suggesting that not only did you used to do drugs, you haven't even stopped. Lawyers, man. The point is, the lawyer doesn't want to ask you about that at all. They want to assume it. They want to presuppose it. We do this all the time. If I say, can you hand me the red book, I'm making a request, not inquiring about the existence of the book. I presuppose it. The does that. So here's one in English first. Though she be but little, she is fierce. Notice Shakespeare's use of the subjunctive there. It's not although she is little, like many of us might say today. This last part basically melted my brain when I first read about it. Not only is it not about doubts or wishes, but it's things the speaker takes for granted and just wants to be background for what they're actually saying. The way we teach this stuff is so far off. So what ties these together? They're all non-assertion. Negation is literally asserting not the thing. Unrealized is not asserted because it hasn't happened yet or isn't real. For all the people in the comments last video asking if subjunctive was about hypothetical or conditional things, you get partial credit. Of course, the Romance languages have conditionals as well, so, you know. And non-assertion is the core of presupposed. It's not what I'm asserting, it's just background, so I can assert some other thing. What makes this really cool is that it helps explain those times when you can use either the indicative or the subjunctive to mean slightly different things. I first realized this was a possibility when I was studying French with Rosetta Stone. Not a plug, by the way, for those of you who don't know. I worked for them years and years ago. Anyway, they had an example sentence that was a version of, I'm looking for someone who can play the guitar. Here's the thing. That's ambiguous. It could mean that I know a specific person, Jimmy, plays the guitar, and I'm looking for Jimmy. Or it can mean I need a guitarist and I'll take anyone who fits the bill. In French, it's not ambiguous. With a specific known person, in some sense, I'm asserting there's someone specific who can play the guitar. That's je cherche quelqu'un qui sait jouer de la guitare, with the indicative. But if I'm just looking for anyone who fits the bill, that's je cherche quelqu'un qui sache jouer de la guitare. Again, with the subjunctive. Again, not doubt. I'm not looking for someone who I doubt knows how to play the guitar. But it's also not fully realized or fully specific. It could be anybody. The grammar I've been using while studying Spanish lately, the one by John Butt, so you know it's got to be good, has a delightful section, quote, in praise of the subjunctive. He gives a bunch of examples of the kind of ambiguity the indicative/subjunctive distinction just entirely avoids. So here's a few. We insist the children are treated well. Are we insisting that it is a fact that they are? Indicative. Or are we insisting that somebody do so? Subjunctive. Hasn't happened, is unrealized. We decided to eat when they arrived. Is it that they arrived and then we decided to eat and the whole thing has happened? Indicative. We decided that we would wait until they arrived, which was unrealized at the point we made that decision, and then eat afterwards? Subjunctive. I'm going to move to a country where it never snows. I know of such a country and I'm going there? Indicative. I still haven't figured out where exactly that is? Subjunctive. He didn't leave because he was angry. Does this mean he stayed because he was angry? Indicative. Does it mean he left but not out of anger? Subjunctive. I didn't know she was so intelligent. Am I conceding that she is that intelligent but I just didn't know? Indicative. Am I suggesting that I'm not committed to the proposition she's so intelligent as maybe someone else suggested? Subjunctive. They're literally all different sentences in Spanish or French or Italian or Portuguese or whatever, but just ambiguous in English. So the subjunctive is actually doing some serious logical work in separating different meanings of sentences. Again, the key points are 1, structural, regardless of meaning, and 2, unasserted, which comes in 3 flavors: negation, unrealized, and presupposed. So instead of weirdo, it should be sun up? This unasserted part also explains the rarer main clause use of the subjunctive. See, I told you I'd get back to it. We don't need to go through all the different examples, but the idea is that when Cicero, that's Cicero to Americans,
Cicero.
says, sit fur, sit sacrilegus, at est bonus imperator. Sit fur, sit sacrilegus, at est bonus imperator. That is, though he be a thief, though he be a temple robber, he's a good general. It works because it's presupposed background. Where Marie Antoinette to have actually said, let them eat cake, it works in a main clause because it's unrealized. Notice, I'm not asserting that she actually did say that because the historical evidence is that she didn't, so I use the subjunctive in English, were she to have said it. I think this is cool, but, your mileage may vary. That qu'il mange la brioche is a full sentence, but it starts with the que that usually marks subordinate clauses. Italian does this too. I know we covered a lot of ground today and opened a bunch of cans of worms that I didn't go down. This touches on everything from presupposition to scope of negation to infinite possible unrealized worlds like Star Trek. But I haven't seen anyone on YouTube talk about this, and it's like the #1 confusing thing for language learners. So hopefully this was as revelatory for you all as it was for me learning about it. The way textbooks cover this is almost always just a grab bag of seemingly unrelated use cases, and I always felt like listing wishes and wants and doubts, and also like maybe it's not a specific thing, was just utterly confusing. It'll still take practice to get really comfortable with it, especially using it intuitively, but recognizing that there's structural reasons for its use and that there's just unasserted stuff, which comes in 3 flavors, negation, unrealized, and presuppositions, should at a minimum explain why somebody else used the subjunctive when they did, and help get you a handle on using it comfortably at appropriate times. Leave me a comment, by the way, if you'd like me to make a video on modal systems and stuff like epistemic and deontic modality or evidentials. That stuff's fun. If you like what I'm doing with the channel, please like and subscribe, and definitely leave a comment. It really helps with the algorithm. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so right here with super thanks, or you can head over to patreon.com/languagejones. Thank you to all my patrons. Until next time, though it be difficult, persist. Were it impossible, it wouldn't exist in those languages. Happy learning.